Hi there, so in this tutorial we are going to build a blog post title generator, and it is going to have the functionality that enables you to create your own trained, fine-tuned model, choosing a name and uploading your own training data. You're then going to wait for that model to be processed, and then you are going to be able to generate blog post titles based on our training set of data. So we can type in something like benefits of cold showers. I'm just going to copy that so I can use it later. So first we can start with the standard GPT 3.5 model, which everyone has access to. So it's suggested these three options for titles: 5 surprising health benefits of cold showers elevate your wellness. So they're pretty good, but they're kind of standard. And then we can put the same prompt in, but choose our fine-tuned model. And you can see it has completely ignored our instruction to give back 3 answers, but it has given what I would class as being a subtly better headline, which is probably more likely to get clicks, more likely to go viral. And that is all because we trained it with all these examples of viral headlines. And that's what we're going to be learning today. So let's get into it. Right, so let's talk about fine-tuning with GPT. So at the time of making this video, fine-tuning for GPT 3.5 Turbo has just been made available. So I thought it's a good time to make a tutorial about how to use fine-tuning. But first, let's understand what fine-tuning is. So obviously with the OpenAI API, when you're dealing with GPT or any of their natural language models, you can send through prompts. And often, if you want to, you can send through very lengthy prompts, which essentially give the model some kind of training about what result you want in return, what output you want. So, for example, if you're making a chatbot for a company, you can feed through some FAQs for that company, and then the chatbot will be able to respond correctly with correct information for the context of that company. The problem with doing things that way is that because GPT has no memory, every time a user comes onto your chatbot and asks a question, you have to send through that entire list of FAQs every time. Otherwise, GPT will not have that information readily available. So fine-tuning, on the other hand, enables you to pass through information and expected responses to GPT and essentially train your own model to respond with this information. So as a result, according to their documentation, you can get higher quality results than with prompting. You have the ability to train on more examples than can fit into a prompt. You have token savings due to shorter prompts because you're not having to pass through all this information in every prompt, and you have lower latency requests. So essentially, by providing a load of examples of the type of output you want from GPT, you are training it, and then you won't need to provide as many examples in the prompt because it will have stored all these examples in its memory, and you will get a custom model that you can use. And then at high level, in order to do it, you need to prepare and upload training data. So we're going to cover that. You need to train a new fine-tuned model. We're going to cover that as well. And then you get to use your fine-tuned model. And then, so if you scroll down a bit further, they talk about when to use fine-tuning. And they essentially say that it's a good idea to try prompt engineering first and chaining your prompts together because you can iterate better, and often you can get very good results by doing that rather than needing to fine tune. So they're actually trying to put you off it kind of. But then they give you some common use cases. So setting the style, tone, format, or other qualitative aspects. So for example, you could train a chatbot to talk in the style of one of your favorite influencers or someone, Steve Jobs. You could feed it loads and loads of Steve Jobs quotes, and then it can be your Steve Jobs bot. And then they give some other common use cases which are all kind of vague, but they say here one high level way to think about these cases is when it's easier to show, not tell. So effectively you can feed in hundreds or even thousands of examples of a question and a response and get a more consistent response from GPT than you would be just by feeding through instructions within the prompt itself. So although this all might sound quite complicated, it's actually not that complicated at all. The only complex part compared to a normal OpenAI API call is that we need to do multiple steps to get this working. So first we need to send our data, then we need to wait for it to train the model, then we need to get the model ID back, and then we need to use that. So it's only a couple more steps than normal, and it really doesn't take that long. So the first step that they talk about here is preparing your data set. And this is key. So you actually just need to compile all of your example data into a text file, all of your training data, and then we're going to upload it, and then it's going to use it to do the training. So they show you here the format for the data set. And it is essentially exactly the same as the normal message object that their API expects when you're doing a normal chat request. So if we look at line 1 here, this is just a message object starting with a curly bracket and then says messages, and then within that we have an array, and here it has role system, and the content is Marv is a factual chatbot that is also sarcastic. So this is the system message that you are sending to the API to essentially explain how you want this API to behave. So sometimes you might say, system message, you are a helpful assistant. Sometimes you might say you're a chatbot that is sarcastic. So whatever your use case is, you're going to customize this. Then you send through another message, and this time it's from the user. And this time it's an example of what a user may ask. So if you're sending through frequently asked questions for your company, then this would be the frequently asked question. And then you send through the assistant's response, which will be the answer to the frequently asked question. So if we go back to the regular chat API here, and you can see the usual format they expect if you're just sending a normal message to their API would be you send through the system message, which is describing what kind of role they're doing, and then you send through a user message. And then in this case, we're also going to send through the assistant message, which would ordinarily be the response from GPT, but in this case, we want to tell GPT what kind of response we're expecting. So we're going to send through this object here, this messages, but it will have one extra message in there, and that is the response from the assistant. And we're going to send that through over and over, many lines of these, so that it can be trained correctly. So if we go back to the documentation and go back to fine tuning. So by the way, if you've ever done fine tuning on the previous models, they had a slightly different format here, but they said the conversational chat format, which is this, is required to fine tune GPT 3.5 Turbo. So that's what we're going to be doing. And then here they say to fine tune a model, you're required to provide at least 10 examples. We recommend starting with 50 well-crafted demonstrations to see if the model shows signs of improvement after fine-tuning. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to train it with 50 examples, and then we're going to test to see if it's made a difference. Right, so the first thing that we need to do is prepare our data set. And the idea I had for what we're going to build is a blog post title generator. So we are going to type in what our blog post is about, and then we're going to select from either the standard GPT model or our own custom one, and we're going to click generate, and it's going to generate a few blog post titles, and we're going to see whether the output is different depending on whether we choose the standard or the trained model. So in order to get training data for this, I actually went in Google and searched for examples of the best blog post headlines, got a few articles, and I just copied and pasted manually all of the best titles that I could find until I had 50. This took me quite a while. I could have obviously asked ChatGPT to generate them, but they wouldn't have been very good, and that would have kind of defeated the purpose of the test. So I got what I thought were some decent ones, and then I went into ChatGPT. So these are all the headlines that I found. They're all kind of really random stuff, but they were in articles that were like, these are the best headlines you'll ever see. And then I asked ChatGPT if it could, for each of these example headlines, create a prompt which might have resulted in the headline. For example, give me a blog headline for a blog about topic. And then I asked it to return all of the information formatted as a JSON-L file, which is the format that we need. And I gave ChatGPT the exact format here, which I just copied and pasted from this example here, but then replaced some of the text with variables. So instead of having the example that was in the documentation, I just replaced it with prompt and headline. And then instead of saying you are Marv, the sarcastic chatbot, I said you are an expert copywriter. So this almost worked, but it didn't actually work. So you can see here it started outputting perfect, exactly what I want. So I want a catchy headline about humorous memes related to the anime fairy tale, and then it put in the article headline which I'd found, and similarly it did the same for all the rest, where it was coming up with good questions. So I'm feeding it example questions and then responses, but it then just said and so on for each headline, and it just said note the above is a representation and not a complete set. So I asked for the complete set, and then it did the same again. It just gave me a few of the answers, but not all of them. So it was kind of useless. So instead, I had to eventually, after asking several times, and it would never give me all of the responses I needed, I just asked it to give me the prompt instead of trying to put it in this format. And then it did so. It gave me all of the prompts that would then result in the answers that I supplied. And so then, now I had it in this format, I just used good old spreadsheet, Google Sheets, to create the data format that I need. So I basically copied one line of this and pasted it into column A. And then when it got to, so I changed the bit Marv as a factual chatbot. I changed that to say act as an expert copywriter. And then when it came to role as user content speech mark, I then pasted in the list of prompts. So this list here that GPT had given me. And then in the next column, I put in the next part of the overall message object. So basically after this bit, up until the next speech marks where I'm expecting the response content from the assistant. Then I pasted in all of the headlines, all of the titles that I had found. And then in the next column, I put in the next or the final part of the JSON object. And then in column F, I said concatenate. So this is a formula, concatenate columns A1 to E1. And then I dragged every column down so that here I have a complete, let me see if I can show more. So here I have the complete JSON objects for each line showing act as an expert copywriter as a system message. For the user message, give me a blog headline about hilarious memes. And then the assistant response is that headline. So this is the training data that I'm now going to upload using the API. And in order to create the actual file, so first I'm just going to copy this concatenated column, and I'm going to open text edit, and then I'm going to go up to my text edit menu, and I'm going to choose the format menu and click make plain text. Okay, because we don't want it to be rich text. And then I'm just going to paste all of that information in there like that. So all of those 50 rows are now in this file. And then I'm going to do file, save, and I'm going to save it as training data good titles. And I'm going to put .jsonl, which is the extension of the file that we need. Okay, and then I'm going to save it. I'm going to get rid of that. Okay, so that file is now saved as a JSON-L file. So here is the file on my computer, and it's definitely worth checking. So get info. It's definitely worth checking that text editor hasn't tried to stick .txt on the end of this. Okay, it shouldn't do, but sometimes it does. I think maybe if you don't untick that box that in the save dialog box. So just make sure it's just .jsonl. And if it is, then that's good and we're good to go. Right, so just to avoid confusion, because there are a few steps, I made a little diagram to show the different steps we're going to do. So the first one, on the left we got Bubble, and on the right we've got OpenAI's API. So the first step is that we're going to upload this training file that we just created. We're going to upload that to the API using one of their upload file API calls. In response to that, OpenAI will return a file ID, which we are then going to use in the next step. So the next step will be to create a fine-tuning job. So that's another API call, and we will pass through the file ID, which is now on OpenAI servers, so that it knows which file it's using for the training. Then, as a response from that API call, OpenAI will send us the job ID of that fine-tuning job. Now, fine-tuning jobs, depending on the amount of data you upload, can take some time, which is why rather than returning the fine-tuned model, and then it's up to us to check whether that job has completed. So we are then going to make a third API call using that job ID to retrieve the fine-tuning job. And if it has been completed, then OpenAI will return to us the custom model ID, which we can then use in our regular API calls. And that will look something like this. So instead of your normal GPT 3.5 Turbo or GPT-4, it will have some kind of custom digits and text in it, which will mean this is specifically our model, which we can use, which is trained with our data. So the next step is to upload the file. So let's go to our API reference here and look at files and scroll down. So we don't want to list files, we want to upload files. So as you can see here, it's a post request and they have given us the endpoint here, and we just need to send through the file. So now let's go to our app and go to plugins, API connector. So we already have our OpenAI API connection set up. If you haven't already done this, essentially you just need to start an account with OpenAI, go to platform.openai.com, get your API key, and then set it up like this. OpenAI, or call it whatever you want, but OpenAI makes most sense. Authentication is private key and header. Authorization is the key name, and then the key value is the word bearer, followed by a space, and then paste in your API key there. And then shared headers for all calls, content-type, make sure you get the capitalization correct, and then application/JSON. So once you've done that, that means you can make as many actual API calls down here, and they will all share this information here, which makes it just a lot easier. So we've already got chat completion and chat completion multi-message here, so we are going to add another call. Now what we can do to make it a bit easier is we can copy this curl example, because the Bubble API connector handily allows you to import calls from curl, and then we can click import, and that just sets it up slightly for us. Doesn't really take away much work, but makes it a little bit easier. And then this we can call file upload, and we want to use this as an action because we actually want to trigger it from a workflow. The data type is going to be JSON, because that's what we're expecting in return. And it is going to be a post request because we are going to be sending data, and that is the endpoint that is specified here. And then it's put in a header here with the API key, but we don't actually need that because we already have that up here, and that's going to be shared by this call. So we can delete that. And then here it's tried to pre-fill the body with information that it thinks we need. But what we actually want, this F here stands for form. So it doesn't actually want a JSON body in the request. It just wants a form, which is one of the options. If we change body type here, we can choose form data, and then we just need to add 2 parameters, which will match exactly these parameters. So purpose needs to be fine-tune, and it says here use fine-tune for fine-tuning. This allows us to validate the format of the uploaded file. So we go back here and type purpose and then fine-tune. tune. And note, we don't need the quote marks when you're sending form data. So it's just fine-tune. And then the next key is going to be the word file. And if we untick private and tick send file, then this will give us the opportunity to upload a file. So the reason we're putting the information in here, as you may know if you've used the API connector, this is the test values that you use when you want to initialize an API call. Initialize means you're essentially doing a test of the API call so that Bubble can learn what the response is going to be, and you can tell Bubble what to do with the response. So you always need to initialize your calls before you can actually use them in your apps, and to do that you have to put in test data, and sometimes it's okay to just put in gibberish, but sometimes, like this, we need to send actual valid data so that it can give us a valid response. So in our case, we are going to initialize this with our actual training data. If you had a huge training file with thousands of lines of examples, you might want to initialize with a file that only has a couple of lines in it. But in our case, because it's only 50 lines, we may as well do it with the full set. So I have uploaded our training data into here, and now we are ready to initialize the call. Okay, great. So that has worked fine. So you can now look through all of these different fields and make sure that everything is the correct format, or Bubble has correctly guessed the format, and that all looks fine. Now, very importantly here, so in the light gray here, we can see the response that we've had. We need to copy the ID from this because we are going to need to use that in our next call. So just copy that to your clipboard or paste it somewhere. Although keep in mind that if you do accidentally copy over it, if you click manually enter the API response, you can get it back here. So now that we've uploaded our file and we've got back the file ID, we now need to trigger the fine-tuning job. So if we go back to the API reference and go to fine-tuning, and then we're going to go to create fine-tuning job, you can see here the information it's expecting. So it's expecting a training file, and that should be the ID of an uploaded file that contains training data. So we already have that ID that it returned to us, and it says your dataset must be formatted as a JSON-L file, which if I didn't say earlier is short for JSON lines, and essentially means JSON data, but without any of the usual commas that you would use to separate objects in JSON. And it also needs the name of the model that we're fine-tuning. So we're going to do GPT 3.5 Turbo. So let's copy this curl example here and import another call from curl. Paste that in. And let's call this one start fine-tuning job. And this is going to be an action as well. And we don't need either of these because those are in our shared header, so we can delete both of those out. And you'll notice here it's tried to put in the body, the JSON object for the body, but it has kind of messed it up. And that does sometimes happen with curls. Whenever you take the curl shortcut to create a call, do check everything because it can mess things up. So that's not what we want. I'm going to delete that out. And I'm going to go back to the reference, and I'm going to copy from the opening and closing curly brackets. So this is the structure of the JSON that it's expecting. So we'll paste that in there. And then we are going to replace the file ABC123 with pointy brackets. And this is just going to be file. So by adding it in pointy brackets, we have created a dynamic value, and you'll see below that we have now the ability to specify the file dynamically. So we're going to untick private because we are in the app we're building, we're going to enable our users to upload their own training files. And then the value here for the purpose of initializing, so the test value, is the file ID that we got earlier. So copy that from wherever you saved it and paste it there. And because this is a real file, this will now enable us to test and initialize this call. So click initialize. Okay, and we've got some kind of error here, validation error. So yeah, it looks like it shouldn't have errored. It looks like it's just got some kind of formatting error. And I think I've spotted it. So it turns out the documentation is actually wrong. This example is wrong because JSON, you always have a comma between lines of data, except on the last line where you do not have a comma. And in their example, they've got a comma here, but they haven't got one here. So if we delete that comma, and hopefully by the time you watch this, maybe they'll have updated their API documentation, maybe not. So now we got a comma after our first line, but not after the second one. And let's initialize again. Great, so that worked. And as before, we need to copy the ID that they've sent us back here. And this is the fine-tuning job ID. So you can see here it has fine-tuned model. If they had magically finished the fine-tuning job by the time we made this call, then it would give us the ID of our fine-tuned model. But because it is not finished, we're going to copy the ID, and then we're going to check back again to see if they've finished. So copy that ID. And now we are on to the third stage, which is we want to get the result of the fine tuning. So we want to find out the name of our custom model, or the ID of our custom model. So if we go back to the API documentation and we want retrieve fine tuning job. And as you can see here, this one's pretty simple. It's a GET request, and you just pass through the ID in the URL, and then it will return this data to us. And the thing we're most interested in is it will give us fine-tuned model, and then it will give us the code or the ID for our fine-tuned model. So let's copy the curl example again and go back here and import another call from curl. And here it is. So let's call this get fine-tuning job result. And we want that to be an action as well. And again, we can delete that because we've already got that in a shared header. And then, so because we're just passing the job ID in the URL, they have given us, the URL they gave us here has an example job ID, but it's not our job ID. So we want to make this a variable. So you can just put in square brackets for parameters. So we can call that job underscore ID. Then that makes that into a dynamic value. So we're going to untick private because we're going to allow people to pass their own job IDs into there later on. And then here in the value, we are going to paste our job ID from our earlier initialization. And now we can initialize this call. So we can see here that finished at is empty and fine-tuned model is empty. So that means the fine-tuning job has still not finished. So we might have to wait for a little while for it to actually finish. But in the time being, I'm just going to change this to date because that will be a date. And I'm going to change finished at to be a date as well. But in the time being, we have initialized this successfully, so we can still save it. Because the important thing, and the reason you do initializing anyway, is just so Bubble can see all the fields that it's going to get back and understand the structure of the data, and also so you can set or Bubble can guess and you can correct the data type or the field type from the data it gets. So for the fine-tuned model, we know that that is going to be a text field. So that's correct. So we can save this, because our 3 API calls are now good to go. And the only other API call we're going to use, the one when we actually get our model, is going to be the chat completion API. So we already have one set up here, but for the sake of completeness, I'm just going to set up another one because there is going to be one small difference. So if we go back to our API reference and we go to chat and then create chat completion, I'm going to copy the example here and I'm going to paste it into the import from curl. So let's call this chat completion dynamic model. And then we're going to make that into an action. We can get rid of both of these. And then within the JSON body, we're going to make the system prompt dynamic. And we are also going to make the user prompt dynamic. But we're also going to make the model dynamic, because this is where we are going to experiment with switching between the standard model and our custom model. There we go. So now I've made those three things dynamic, and I'm going to untick private on all three of them so that we can edit them or make them dynamic in the front end. And then I'm going to put in some test values. So this is going to be GPT 3.5 turbo, and system prompt is going to be you are a helpful assistant. User prompt is going to be tell me a joke, and then we're going to initialize the call. Okay, so we've got an error. So let's have a look at our JSON here. Okay, and the problem I can see is that it's expecting quote marks around all of these three dynamic values, and I put them around these two, but I forgot to put them around here. So let's try again. Great, so that worked, and it has given us a classic joke. Make that date. But yeah, all of this looks fine. Let's just show the raw data so we can read that joke. Why don't scientists trust atoms? Because they make up everything. So it always gives the same joke when you initialize. I don't know why. So that call is now initialized, so that's ready to go. So let's get started on our app. So what I've got here, just one page. It's got this title generator part, but in the corner it's also got something that says create model. And if you click on that, you get a little pop-up which says gives you an opportunity to name your model and then also upload, so file uploader to upload your training data. So this is just the raw UI. I have not added any workflows here, and that's what we're going to do now. So if we go to the page, and then I'm just going to find the pop-up. So this is just a regular file uploader. This is just a regular input. And on the create button, I'm going to add a workflow. Well, first, actually, I'm going to check that I named the inputs correctly. File uploader, training data. And that enables me to find them when I'm making my workflow. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new thing. And that is going to be a fine tuning. So I created a data type called fine tuning. Ignore all these other data types because that's all from, this is just a test app where I do loads of tutorials. I made a new data type called fine tuning, and within that, it has got the different IDs that we get returned from OpenAI that we need. So the file ID from the initial upload, the fine tuning job ID, and then the fine tuning model ID, and then the name of the fine tuning and the training file. So if we go back here, add all the fields. So I don't have the file ID yet. I don't have that yet. I don't have that yet, but I do have the name, and that's going to be input model names value. And the training file is going to be file uploader training data's value. Then next we're going to do our first API call. So we're going to go down to plugins, and we're going to look at all the different OpenAI calls that we've got, and the one we want is file upload. And then here we are going to use dynamic link, and that is going to be the result of step one's training file. And I'm not quite sure why that is there, because we selected form, but I'll just leave that there and hope that it works anyway. And then next we're going to make changes to a thing, and that is going to be make making changes to the results of step 1's fine tuning, and we are going to update the field file ID, and that is going to be the result of this API call's ID. I'm also going to show an alert to say success file ID is result of step 3's file ID. So at least I'll know that if this is empty, then something has gone wrong. And I also want to hide the pop-up. And I'll actually put this step at the start of the workflow to give a snappier user experience. Then next I am going to do the second API call. So going back to plugins, we want to start a fine-tuning job, and the file is going to be result of step 4's file ID. And then again in step 6 we're going to make changes to result of step 2's fine-tuning. We are going to update the fine-tuning job ID to be the result of step 6's ID. And I'm going to do another alert. Job ID is fine-tuning job ID. So at least we can see the progress as it's going. So once it has started the job going, then the issue is that we don't know how long that is going to take. It might take 2 seconds, or it might take 20 minutes, or it might take an hour. But until we have that fine-tuned model ID, we're not going to be able to use it. So one way you could deal with that is you could create a custom event here. Check if model completed. And then on this workflow, you could schedule custom event, check if model completed, and you could put in a delay of like, 60 seconds. And then in here, you'd have the API call to check to see if the model has completed yet, and then save it to the fine tuning if it has. The way I would actually do it wouldn't be this way. This is good. If you're on the free bubble plan, then you could do this, and you could also have a button on the page where the user can refresh and basically manually trigger another API call to check if it's completed successfully yet. But the better way to do it, if you're on a paid plan, you can do this, is to use backend workflows. So I'm going to go to backend workflows, and I'm going to create a new API workflow, and we're going to untick that because it's not a public workflow, and we're going to say check if model complete, and we're going to send through one piece of data, which is going to be the fine tuning data thing that we've created. And then we want to do another API call, so it's going to be OpenAI get fine tuning job result, and the job ID is going to be insert dynamic data fine tuning. So that's the fine tuning that we're going to pass through from the front end of our site. So fine tuning job ID. So that will do the API call and the check, and then we want to make changes to a thing, fine tuning, and the thing we want to change is the fine tuning model ID, and that's going to be the result of step 1's fine tuned model. So that will save the model ID to our bubble database, and we will be able to access it. But if the API says the job has not been completed yet, and this is empty, so this will be empty, then we need to check again. So what we can do is schedule the same workflow to run again, but instead of doing current date and time, we can do current date and time plus seconds, 30 seconds. So it's going to reschedule itself to run again in 30 seconds time. The fine tuning we're going to send through is going to be the same fine tuning that came through at the start of this one. So that means this is going to run every 30 seconds, but we don't want it to run every 30 seconds infinitely because that would be crazy. So we need a way to make it stop. So to do that, we are going to put a condition here. So it should only schedule itself again, only when the result of step 2's fine-tuning model ID is empty. Okay, so if this is empty, then it will schedule itself again. But as soon as it does actually get a response from the API where it gets the fine-tuned model, then this will fail and it will no longer schedule it again. So this loop will end. So now if we go back to our page, then here at the end of this workflow, we can schedule that workflow to run. Checker model complete. We want it to run, let's say current date time plus 30 seconds. And the fine tuning is going to be result of step 2's fine tuning. So just to summarize, this workflow is going to first hide the pop-up, then it's going to create a new fine tuning thing in our database. It's going to save the file to that fine tuning. Then it's going to do an API call where it uploads the file to OpenAI. And then it's going to save the file ID that it gets back from OpenAI onto the fine-tuning thing. It's going to show us an alert. Then it's going to start a fine-tuning job, doing an API call again. Then it's going to save the result of that back onto our fine-tuning object. So it's going to save the job ID, and then we are going to schedule an API workflow 30 seconds later, which is going to check if the model has been completed. And that is going to check every 30 seconds until it gets back a response. And then finally, for this rather lengthy workflow, we need a way to check to see if the model has actually been completed, so we can let the user know. And as we're just going to be waiting on this page for it to finish, so you could in the backend workflow have an email triggered that goes to the user to say your model is complete. I'm just going to show a little alert on the page when it's completed. But the problem is you can, at the moment, this fine tuning that we created here can only be referred to in this workflow. Outside of this workflow, if we created a new workflow here and said, tried to refer to this fine tuning we've created, we wouldn't be able to. And that's exactly what we want to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a custom state to save the fine tuning. And it's only going to save it temporarily until the page is refreshed, but for our purposes, that's fine. But otherwise, you'd probably want to send an email notification from your backend workflow to say your fine-tuning model is ready. So let's just set a state, and I'm going to set it on the page itself, so that's fine-tuned. I almost always put my custom states on the page itself, and I'm just going to call it fine-tuning, and it's going to be type of is fine-tuning, and that's going to be equal to the result of step 2, create fine-tuning. And then that means I can create another workflow here to say do when condition is true, and only when fine-tuning model ID is not empty, then we want to show alert, standard alert. And by the way, if you don't have this alerts in your app, you can add it. It's just a plugin called Air Alert by AirDev. It's pretty good. So we can say success, your fine-tuning model ID is, and then we can refer to fine-tuned model ID. So when this becomes true, so it's going to be empty, but then when it becomes not empty, then we're going to see that alert. So let's try this out. So the first thing we want to do is create our model. And at this point, you might be saying, we've already done all of this. Why are we doing it again? And the reason is you could perfectly well use the model that you get from when you initialize all your calls, because that model, as far as OpenAI is concerned, all the information you've been sending to it has not been test information, it's real information, and the model it has returned really exists. So you could use that if you actually uploaded your full training data in that initializing. But the reason we're doing it like this is because I wanted to show you how, if you wanted to enable your users to create their own models, or if you are your only user, to create your own models through the front end of the site, rather than needing to do everything through the initializing. So let's give it a model name, and this will be blog title generator v1, and let's upload our file, and then click create, and we'll see what happens. Okay, so we immediately got an error, and it's saying the start fine-tuning job just returned an error. File is not ready. Okay, let's go back to our workflow here, and so it seems like after we've done the upload and then it saved the file ID, and then we try to start the fine-tuning job, it's not yet ready to do that because it's probably still checking our file and validating it. So we probably need to wait for a few seconds before this happens. Now, ordinarily, if I was building this, I would probably put most of this stuff into back-end workflows, because generally you don't want to have like really long workflows like this in your front end. But in our case, I'm going to use a custom event. So let's create a custom event, and that's going to be start fine-tuning job. And we are going to add a parameter which is fine-tuning, of type fine-tuning. And then we're going to copy, or rather cut and paste, all of these latter steps. That's going to be fine-tuning. Copy, paste. Oh, sorry, I meant to cut that. Cut and paste. And then we just need to fix all of these. So these are all referring to the fine tuning. That's going to be the result of step 1's ID. And then there's going to be fine tunings, or no, let's say, if we refer to the result of a certain step, then it will make sure that that step runs before this step runs. Otherwise, sometimes they can run, or they usually run all at the same time. And then this is going to be fine tuning. And then we're going to set the state to be fine tuning. Okay, so now we just need to schedule that custom event, and the fine tuning is going to be the result of step 2's fine tuning, and the delay, let's put 30 seconds delay. Hopefully that will give it enough time to validate our file. So let's try again. So create model, blog titles v2, and select our file. Okay, so we've got the file ID. Great, so we've got a job ID, which means it has started the job. And now it's going to wait 30 seconds again and check every 30 seconds to see if we have our model back. Right, so I'm back, and I missed the notification because it actually took about 11 minutes from the time we created this fine-tuning to when the last modified date is, which is when it created our model ID. So 11 minutes to do the training on that data. So just for future reference, depending on how much training data you're uploading, that's the kind of time period you can expect to wait for. So therefore you might want to check every 1 minute or every 5 minutes to see if it's been completed, and then just send an email to your user to say your model is ready to use. Now in my database here, you'll see we've got this one that we've just created, and it's got the fine-tuning model ID here. And I also just created, by doing new entry, I created another fine-tuning, but the only things I filled in were the name, and the model ID I put here is just GPT-3.5-turbo. So that is going to enable us to select one of the two models from a drop-down menu and test which one performs better. So now let's go to the interesting part, which is actually testing out our models. So this is just a standard input. This is a drop-down, and it is just doing search for fine-tunings. Obviously, if you have users who are creating their fine-tunings, but you don't want them to use other people's models, you might want to do created by equals current user. But for the sake of this, I'm just going to leave it empty, because I think the GPT one I created would have just been by app admin, not by actually any user. And then I'm displaying the current options name, and then the generate button. So we need to add a workflow here. I've also got somewhere on this page, I've got a group. No, I've got another group result. So this is just a standard group, but I've set the type of content to be text, and the data source is empty. And then within it, there is some text, and its data source is the parent group's text. So group result at the moment has nothing, but when the API, when OpenAI gives us a response, we're going to display it in this group, and that will pass down to this text element here. So let's create a workflow here. So when text generate is clicked, we want to do an API call, and that's going to be OpenAI chat completion dynamic model. And the model that we want to send through is going to be drop down chooser models values, and then we want the fine-tuning model ID, and we want to surround that with quote marks, because that is what the JSON requires. And then for the system prompt, we could make this dynamic, but in our case, I think we're just going to hard code it, and that's just going to be, you are an expert copywriter. Of course, we could allow the user to just type a system prompt into the field, but for the purpose of this app, that doesn't really make much sense. And then for the user prompt, we are going to say input what's your post about value, but then we're also going to say formatted as JSON safe. And so what that means is, currently, if someone were to type something in this box, but they were to put in any kind of punctuation like question mark, speech mark, colons, certainly curly braces, that would all confuse the JSON and it wouldn't work. So by using this formatted as JSON safe expression, that means it will convert the value that they've typed in into JSON safe text, which means it will replace any of those characters that would otherwise screw things up with kind of codes that represent those characters, and it will also wrap the value in quote marks, so we don't need to actually put quote marks around this. So definitely always do that if there's somewhere where your user is typing something in that you are trying to send through to OpenAI. And then next we want to display data in a group or pop-up, and that is going to be group result, and the data is going to be the result of step 1's choices, first items, message content. And you may recall you always choose choices first item. The choices thing is kind of redundant. OpenAI, essentially in an older version of their API, they used to give multiple choices, and they said they might do that in the future, so they've decided to leave this in. But currently it's always the first they only ever send through one choice. So it's the first items, and then we want the message content. So that is everything. We can also reset relevant inputs as well. Oh, and actually, I've just thought one thing we could add. At the moment, if we wanted the prompt to make sense, we would need to type in, please write me a blog title for a blog about, or something like that, because that is what the training data said we were going to say. So actually, let's add that into the prompt here. So instead of just directly referring to the input, let's use arbitrary text, which just means you have a bit more space to play with. And let's start it with, please give me 3 compelling blog post titles for a blog about, and then input what's your post about value, and close that, and then we're going to wrap that whole thing in this formatted as JSON safe. And so that will mean we have this slight custom prompt in there, and then whatever the person types. And that makes more sense for the user because we said, what's your post about? So here we should just be able to type a topic. Okay, so what's our post about? Cats versus dogs. And let's start with the standard model and see what it comes up with. Battle of the Pets, exploring the eternal debate. Okay, so they're all, fairly standard responses. Now let's put the same thing in again, but choose our custom model. Okay, so that's interesting. So it's given us what I would say is probably a more interesting title than the 3 offered by the standard model. But even though we asked for 3 titles, it's only given us 1. And so that's probably because in all the training data we had just said give us 1. So let's try another one. Bananas make you live forever. Start with the standard model. Surprising science how bananas could extend your lifespan. Unveiling the secret of bananas could be the key to immortality. So yeah, they're all pretty boring, aren't they? And now let's choose this one. Food myth busted. Bananas make you live forever. No, bananas don't make you live forever. The banana myth that refuses to die. Okay, so you can see definitely the responses are less formulaic than the other ones, and I guess have the potential to possibly go more viral. They're a bit more controversial statements than the kind of very standard headlines we're getting from the standard model. So from this, I would say, yes, the fine tuning has definitely worked to some extent. We are getting quite different results using our fine-tuned model as we are from using the normal GPT 3.5, and we are giving exactly the same prompt each time. Whether or not these headlines are better is up for debate, but I think it all depends on the training data, and obviously I just picked these kind of without doing much research, just getting a list from some various articles, so they might not actually be the best headlines, but you can see how even with a training set of just 50 items, it has made a difference to the outcome. So I hope this has been useful. I hope you've learned something about using fine tuning, but don't forget that, as OpenAI said in their API documentation, definitely experiment first with just honing your prompts and providing examples in your prompts before you go down the fine tuning route, because this obviously has extra costs and extra time associated with it.